and working on that study, and here we are 12 months later going over that study. And so there's several representatives from Porzio and their consultants. And I'm going to introduce Porzio right now, and they'll take it from here.
Thank you, Darren. It is wonderful to be back here and to see some faces that I saw many years ago. So my name is Carrie Wright. I'm a partner at Porzio, Bromberg & Newman. The board hired the law firm Porzio, Bromberg & Newman to facilitate this feasibility study. I'm going to start off with just an overview of it, and then I'm going to introduce the members of our team. First, I want to say that the members of the team that I'm going to introduce, they're the individuals that actually drafted the feasibility study. So even though myself and my partner, Vito Gagliardi, have been doing these types of studies for about 20 years, we are lawyers. So we help them with the legal analysis of what's required by statute, what's required by code, what the process is, different issues that go into these types of feasibility studies. But generally speaking, the drafting is done by the individuals with expertise in the various areas that need to be studied for you to move forward with any regionalization effort by the state. So the state provides what you need to study and what the Commissioner of Education needs to have in order for you to move forward with any new district regionalization or the dissolution of a regional school district. Those things are all in this study. So you have, I'll say, gobs of information at your fingertips. The full study is about 160 pages long. So it's light reading, take it to the beach. The portions of the study are broken down into generally a few areas. So the first area is your demographics and your enrollment projections, because you need to know exactly how many students you're going to have potentially 5 or 10 years out in order to know, first, will they fit, and then what will the finances look like. Part of that is the state wants to know what the demographics of your population will look like, to know whether you're disrupting the racial balance of your students in any of the schools. So that was done by the man floating behind me on the screen, Dr. Richard Grip. Dr. Richard Grip is one of our nation's foremost school demographers. He does all of the enrollment projections for the New York City public schools. And he's probably done more than 100 demographic analyses and probably more than 30 feasibility studies. So I'm going to give him an opportunity to speak in a few minutes, but the next folks on our team and the next section in the study is the educational analysis. So even though I've been around educators my entire career and I've served 15 years on my local board, I'm not an educator. So that section in the feasibility study was drafted by Dave Hespy and Mary Robinson Cohen, Porzio Compliance Services. Dave Hespy was twice the Commissioner of Education in New Jersey. He has served as a superintendent of schools. He served as a president of the county college. Mary Robinson Cohen has served as superintendent of schools. So they have a wealth of information in terms of what would be the educational impact of regionalizing. We know that Pittsgrove and Elmer are already a consolidated district, so what would the educational impact of moving Newfield students from where they are right now in Delsea and Franklin over to the Pittsgrove School District? So I'll give them an opportunity to speak in a few minutes. And then last but certainly not least, if the finances don't work, I'm certain this isn't moving forward. So that is Steve Sia. Steve Sia has served as a business administrator for several school districts and has performed a number of these studies. So you'll hear from him the financial analysis as well as what our recommendation is for the tax levy moving forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Grip first. He's going to go over the enrollment projections and the demographic analysis. We'll take any questions from the board, from the boards, plural. Would you like to take questions on each section or when we're done? When we're done, okay. So, well, I'm actually going to say with one exception, Dr. Grip is not able to stay for the entire time. So, I'll let Dr. Grip go over his section, and then if you have any questions for him, if a question for him comes up, after either the education or the finance presentation. We're very capable of answering those questions as well for him, so we'll jump in as well. So no worries if you forget a question that you have. Rich, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. Good evening, everybody. I'm sorry I cannot be there. I'm actually doing an in-person presentation for the East Brunswick Board of Ed tonight with about 15 or so men. So I will try to be brief on what we've done. And I cannot see the PowerPoint, so I'm just going to assume that you're seeing the scenarios slide that we began with. Is that up there, Carrie?
It is not. Okay, so let me take a second and go over okay, there it is.
Okay. So I will just say next when I'm ready to advance, since I cannot see it.
Okay.
As Terry had mentioned, one of the things we're looking at tonight is two things. We're looking at a comparison of the status quo where all the students stay exactly where they're being educated right now, as well as moving Newfield students from Franklin and Delsey over to Pittsgrove and Elmer. So it's really the Newfield students that are the ones that are changing places here. Next slide, please. And the next to my bio. So I possess a doctorate from Rutgers University in Educational Statistics and Measurement. I've been doing this type of work for about the last 25 years for a company called Statistical Forecasting. We've done more than 200 school districts in the state in time in terms of demographic studies. I publish on this topic both in peer-reviewed journals as well as conferences around the country, and have testified as an expert witness in administrative law hearings on the same matter. Next slide, please. So the next slide should be a map of the school districts and the towns of interest in this particular study. So you can see where Newfield is located with respect to Pittsgrove and Franklin and Elmer, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So what I looked at as a demographer is I looked at an overview of all the communities involved. So we looked at Elmer, Newfield, and Pittsgrove, of course, because those are the three major players to become a regional. But we also had a look at the constituent municipalities of Delsey, which would be Franklin and Elk, because they would also be impacted if Newfield students were to leave their school districts. So just a few comments about the projected and historical populations of each of the communities. I can just say that of all the communities, Franklin has the biggest population in the 2020 census of over 16,000 people. Pittsgrove has the second greatest, around 8,800, and Elmer has the smallest at about 1,350. We also looked at relevant demographic characteristics in each community, such as race, education, income, median housing prices, to get an idea of what the communities are like. Are they similar? Are they different? So in case you did do a move, what kind of communities would you be commingling with? Next slide, please. So going more into the demographic characteristics, each of the communities has the largest race being white, ranging from 73 to 87% in the different communities. Hispanics are the second largest race in each community except Elk, where blacks, African Americans are the second largest. Median household income ranges from $83,000 to $116,000, where the state median is about $86,000. Elmer has the lowest income, while Elk has the highest. The median value home prices range between $187,000 and $260,000, where Elmer has the lowest median home value and Elk has the highest. Education levels for bachelor's degree or higher are all lower than the state average, which is 41%. So the range is between 20 and 39%. Next slide, please. So after we looked at the communities at large and their demographic characteristics, then we drilled down lower to the school districts. So we looked at the historical enrollments for all of the 4 districts that are involved in this study: Franklin, Delsey, Pittsgrove, and although Newfield doesn't educate its own students, we have to look at how many students they've had K to 12 so that we can figure out how they will impact the district that they're going into. So what you can see in this slide is that Newfield has had increasing enrollments over the last 5 or 6 years. And their whole K to 12 population in the 21-22 school year, which is the last year of data that we had, was 258 students. Franklin has been fairly stable before they declined. Delsey has been increased up to 19-20 year before they reversed trend. And Pittsgrove has been fairly stable over this time period. Next slide, please. So we also look at birth counts, because they're used to project kindergarten students 5 years later. Franklin had the greatest number of births of all the communities. Pittsgrove had the second greatest number. Now, Franklin's had a declining birth rate, and usually when you see that right away, that's going to foretell declining kindergarten populations in the future, and also declining kindergarten enrollment. We also contacted the planning and zoning departments of each community to find out if there's any new housing starts that could impact our enrollment projections, because if there is a significant number, we would take the baseline enrollment projections and increase them for the new students expected. However, there's not much housing going on in any of these communities. The biggest developments is a 15 single-family home in Elk and a 10 single-family home development in Pittsgrove. Nothing is planned or under construction in Elmer, Franklin, or Newfield. Next slide, please. So we did project enrollment for a 10-year period as per the grant. We typically project for 5 years out, because years 6 through 10 is very difficult to project, as we then have to start projecting the kids that haven't been born yet. So I always tell people, take a look at the first 5 years. We have a lot greater certainty with those numbers than years 6 through 10. But we did do a 10-year projection. We did it for each of the school districts. We did it for each of the schools in the district. And we looked at what the combined enrollment would be if Elmer, Newfield, and Pittsgrove joined forces. And we're looking at enrollments to be fairly stable if that was to occur through the 26-27 year before they begin to increase. So at the end of the 10-year period, we're expecting enrollment to be somewhere around 2,000 students, 1,992 to be exact, which if you had combined it in the most current year that we had enrollment, the 2021 year, that would be a gain of about 75 students from where we are right now. Next slide, please. So we also have to determine whether the existing buildings can accommodate the Newfield students. So Pittsgrove currently has exceeding surpluses in each school. The Elmer school is projected to be at capacity in the next 5 years. We only looked at this issue for 5 years out in the status quo. But if we have Newfield students join into the regional, we believe that the Elmer school building would be above capacity, and you would have a shortage of seating of about 55 students. The remaining schools in the district would have ample space. We also looked at the economically disadvantaged student population in each of the schools, and we saw that they're fairly similar, ranging from 14% in Delsey and 25% in Pittsgrove, and that's the free weekly lunch population. Next slide, please. So as Terry mentioned, one of the things the state wants us to look at is something called racial impact, which most of you probably don't even realize we have to do. So what that means is when we take Newfield students and remove them from Franklin and Delsey, will the racial composition of Franklin and Delsey change significantly after Newfield students leave? And likewise, if Newfield students join Pittsgrove and Elmer, would their composition of that district change? And I can tell you that if you look at this slide, very interestingly, we looked at the percentages by race for each of the schools for the last 6 years. I do a lot of these studies, and I can unequivocally say that the race of the Newfield population, Franklin, Delsey, and Pittsgrove are really, really similar. And we don't see that very often. The range in the minority population, which is anything but white, ranges from about 22 to 28%. But if you look just down that rows, the white populations are fairly similar, Hispanic is fairly similar, Black, Asian, so on and so forth, which makes our job a little easier when we go to the next slide. Because the last slide says that we do not anticipate there's going to be no negative racial impact upon removing Newfield students from Franklin and Delsey. And why is that? Well, there's two reasons. Well, first of all, The Newfield population is fairly small. We said there's 250 students K to 12. When you start taking that and dividing it up into smaller subpopulations by school, it's really not going to change the population in Franklin and Delsey very much because there's just not that many students that you're pulling out. And the second reason is that the racial composition of Newfield students is very similar to that of Franklin and Delsey, so that's why we're not expecting much change in the racial composition of either Franklin or Delsey. Hence, we came to the conclusion there would be no negative racial impact. On the flip side, by bringing Newfield students into Pittsgrove, the same thing. We don't expect the racial composition to be very different because of the small sample size of Newfield students, as well as the similar racial composition. So what we conclude is that the Newfield students would be afforded the same racial diversity in the schools that in Pittsgrove that they are currently experiencing in Franklin and Delsey. So with that, that's the end of my piece of the report. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Are there any questions from the board? All right, Dr. Grip, I don't see any hands raised, so we will release you to your other presentation for this evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Carrie, and if people do have questions, please feel free to call or email me with those questions.
Louise Funzer.
We certainly will.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you very much.
So for the next section of the study, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Dave Hespy, and as I had said, if the boards have any questions that come up for the enrollment projections or demographic section, we're certainly capable of answering, I'll say probably 95% of those questions.
Thank you. Dave Hespy, Mary Robinson Cohen. We will be doing the educational presentation tonight. We looked at two issues in this report. The first issue involved the termination of the sending receiving agreements between Newfield and Franklin and Delsey, and the second issue was the Elmer, Pittsgrove, and Newfield forming a regional district. This was challenging because we're involving a small number of students, 260 to 70 students from Newfield, moving to a organizational structure that already exists. It's already a PK to 12 with Elmer and Pittsgrove in a regional, in a consolidated configuration. So we're seeing educationally that small number of students moving to a new organizational existing organizational structure. As you'll see as we move through the educational analysis, those fractional, we're talking 15%. If you bring Newfield students on the Pittsgrove's existing students, maybe 15% of your student body will now be Newfield. So we're seeing a small number of students, same at Franklin and Delsey, around 10%. At Franklin, I think Newfield finally has qualified for a representative. At Franklin at 10%, and a little lower at Delsey, around 8 and change at Delsey. So we're looking at fractional movement of students from one to the other. A little bit about Porzio Compliance Services. So Mary and I both work for Porzio Compliance Services. I have done a lot of work in South Jersey. Of course, I was a professor at Rowan for a decade, Burlington County College president, superintendent, assistant superintendent in Willingboro. So know South Jersey very well. Mary Robinson Cohen, of course, has done a tremendous amount of work. I thought you did your superintendent residency down here, I believe. So we understand the area well, and we're able to bring that expertise to bear on this issue. So as I said, these are the two issues we examined. The first, the termination of the sending receiving agreement, and then the educational implications of Newfield joining with Elmer and Pittsgrove to form this new PK to 12 regional. The way we normally work the educational analysis is we do a tremendous amount of data collection. We're preparing this report for a number of different audiences, certainly the boards and your community, but also the Commissioner of Education will need to sign off on this and will use this report as the basis for this. The voters, if this goes to the voters, will also be able to use the data analysis in these reports. And that's why you'll see it heavy, as Terry was indicating at the very beginning, very heavy with data. So we collected all types of educational metrics, student performance metrics, climate indicators, college and career readiness indicators, and those are a snapshot in time. We collected all this data in the spring of 22, so everything was fixed as of that moment in time. And then once we've collected the data, we'll compare those against best practices that we have found to be research-based and linked to student performance and the attributes of successful schools. Our conclusion, I always like to have the conclusion up front. You can think about it as you go through the slides. We did not see any negative educational issues as a result of the severance of the sending and receiving agreements. Again, because of the small student population that will be moving, the impact might be just a couple of students per classroom. The main impact will probably here be financial on the districts, so long as that doesn't then come back and impact the educational program. We believe that there will not be any major educational issues there. Each district will continue to have sufficient students in the classrooms to have a good educational experience. We believe class sizes will decrease slightly, but we don't believe from this moment that will lead to large-scale reductions in programs. We have identified some concerns with the disruption of friend and community groups. However, whenever students go to a school, they will form partnerships, and we're proposing a transitional phase out to allow Newfield students to develop new partnerships and friends groups in their new district. Advantages of regional district. Again, this was difficult because we're adding 15% to the student body, but conceivably, and I think the way to look at this is what challenges does Elmer and Pittsgrove have that the addition of this capacity, these 15% addition to your student body, will bring a significant amount of resources with them? And how could a new regional board take advantage of that new capacity to take on some of those challenges that we see? So things in curriculum and instructional areas, professional development, human resources, special populations. Certainly each one of the districts has a overclassification problem. Overclassification, in my mind, is you take the state average, you take your district average. Are you classifying more than the state average? You are. Is it an intervention issue? Is it what happens in transitions? Is it social emotional issues that are developing? Chronic absenteeism issues, we'll discuss these a bit later, I'm sure. This is one of the areas where Pittsgrove High School has a challenge. Chronic absenteeism, at the moment that I collected the data in the spring of 22, was very high, and higher, very much higher than Delsey High School. And so those are issues that you certainly want to look at as this capacity comes. And certainly it is an issue that you're going to have to take steps on. Now, a lot of that could have been pandemic driven. A lot of schools had issues with attendance during the pandemic. Again, Fixing it in '22 means that you're just coming out of the pandemic. The data in my analysis was collected by the state the year prior, but still it's something to stay focused on, and the capacity that the Newfield students bring should allow you additional resources to do that. To transition again, our thoughts on this was that in order to allow for those friends groups that were formed with Franklin and Delsey, that there's going to need to be time, and so we're indicating this transition should occur where students be allowed to finish in the school they're currently at in either Franklin or Delsey. Oftentimes people want to know, well, in past regionalizations in the state of New Jersey, what benefits have happened? What have we seen? And fortunately, Mary Robbins Cohen has lived that professionally in her world at South Hunterdon Regional and elsewhere. So I'm just gonna, Mary, you want to just
Thank you. Good
talk a
evening,
little bit about that?
everyone. I do, and I'm happy to be here tonight. And I did live it. I've been an administrator in 2 districts that have undergone regionalization, and I know it's a scary concept, but in South Hunterdon, certainly the efficiencies were much greater when everything was done. The district that I retired from has not completed the regionalization, it's still undergoing it. But certainly in curriculum and instruction, in professional development, we had 4 districts merge into 1. And certainly the outcome was very positive. So I'm happy to answer questions about that if anyone has them. Thank you. Thanks, Dave.
So we're completing the educational section, and I believe we're going downwards, going to wait until the end for the education and the finance section questions from the board. Is that correct? Or do you want to take them now?
I guess we can pick them now, you know.
Okay, fine. Or we can take them at the end. Darren, I'll work this first, Steve.
Oh, perfect.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Steve Sia. I completed the finance section, and I'm going to just go to the next slide. I'm going to start by taking a close look at the framework that we used, some of the documents used in order to develop the model for comparing the 2 scenarios. So, as you can see from this slide, we used 2 of the most recent audits. We used actual revenues and expenses. It's important that sometimes when you're using budgets to do your projection, the budgetary numbers are not as accurate as the actuals. So that's the thrust of the bulk of the information that we received. We also did use budgeted numbers to take a look at state aid and state aid trends. We used the enrollment projections that Dr. Brick had discussed earlier in the presentation, and other data from state sources, from the districts. We bring all this together to build a projection of revenues and expenses over the 5 and a 10-year period. So the model's also built on some assumptions, and that's on the next slide. So the report has a number of assumptions in it. I'm going to go over just a few of some of the more significant assumptions that we used. And the first is that the estimates of tax levy and rates are for comparative purposes. So this is designed to be a projection, trying to compare the district's status quo to the regional scenario on an apples-to-apples basis. And it's indeed a projection. It's not really designed to be a prediction of what the tax levy is going to be, because as we will review later in the presentation, there are a lot of things that the new board can opt to do that may change the tax implications, and we'll go through that toward the end. We also assume that there's going to be full implementation in year 1, and that gives us a better indication of what the financial impact is going to be. We do show a transition, and we'll go through that, but in terms of the financial data and tax levy impacts, that's assuming that we are starting full implementation in the first year. The state aid approximates the aid that was received in the 2021 year. There's a new law that allows districts that are entering into a regionalization to secure their state aid, either at current levels or a greater level, depending on what the formula yields. So that builds into that assumption. We also use a regression analysis to project the 10 years of equalized valuation. And this is important, we'll go through this in a moment, but no change in the educational program. So essentially what that means is that we are maintaining the same student-teacher ratios as exist in the district before regionalization, because we want to make sure that those educational programs, we're not building in a smaller class size or a larger class size. We want to make sure that they're consistent in both scenarios. So if we go to the next slide, referendum requirement simply indicates that each community will have to vote on regionalization. And what that means from the finance perspective is that the allocation that we come up with should try and allocate the savings across each community so that everyone sees some tax levy reductions. That's not always the case when we do these studies, and we could find a proportion of equalized valuation and enrollment that saves each community some money. In this case, that there are ample ways to getting that done, and we're going to go through that when we go through the examples. There's a traditional allocation method that the state wants to use in order to allocate taxes, and they use two variables, either equalized valuation, enrollment, or some combination of those two. They do provide for a transitional allocation. We're going to go through that, the new law that was passed and signed into law about a year ago that allows for a transition. Usually that happens when districts can't find a traditional allocation method that saves everyone money. That's not the case here, but we're going to propose a transition because of some unique circumstances that we're going to get into in a moment. The net tax reduction that we've seen by combining the two districts is about $1.3 million over the 5-year period. In the 10-year period, it climbs to about 1.5 million. What's that?
Annually.
Annually, correct.
1.3 million annually over that 5-year projection.
Over the 5-year period. And we'll get into the annual savings for each community in a moment, but the important thing to realize with those savings is a lot of that's generated because of the non-operating district essentially being dissolved and those students coming to the new regional. So on the tables, just a couple of conventions that the dollar figures are in thousands and the tax rates are per $100 of equalized property value. So it is rare that we have an opportunity to propose an allocation method that's driven by savings for all communities, regardless of what proportion we choose from equalized valuation to enrollment. So essentially, and you'll see in the report that we provide certain allocations, one at 100% equalized valuation, another at 100% enrollment, and then the proposed allocation of 50% equalized valuation and 50% enrollment. That does a number of things, but each of those wide range of allocations provides savings for all the communities. So how do we come up with this 50% breakdown allocation. And there are a few factors that went into this. The first is that it certainly provides balance of savings for each community. But I think more importantly, it mitigates some future risk. What it does is essentially hedge against major swings in either one of those two variables. So if one community sees a big drop in equalized valuation, another one sees a big increase in enrollment, since each one of those pieces are only 50% of the allocation that's used to calculate the tax levy, there's no, it mitigates the impact of that. So if you had a very large increase in equalized valuation and your allocation method was 100% equalized valuation, you would see a significant impact in the tax levy. By having 50-50, it reduces or mitigates the risk associated with swings either way. And it's important because we have been to some districts and done some studies where communities started with a certain allocation, and over time, for many years, they may see growth or reductions in enrollment or some fluctuation that then impacts their tax burden, tax allocation, and this sort of has the effect of reducing that impact, which I think bodes well. And it's, as I mentioned before, there's a rare opportunity. We rarely have an opportunity to present a allocation method that serves that purpose in addition to saving the community's money. So I want to go through the slide here and stress, as we just mentioned, that the savings on this slide are averages over a 5 and 10 year period, but they're annual, so they're annual savings. So, for example, and again, these numbers are in thousands. So, Pittsgrove, their status quo tax levy is projected at $11.6 million. The 5-year average would be $11.4 million. So, the tax reduction, the tax savings, is $261,000 each year over the 5-year period. Elma would see almost $100,000 of annual tax savings. Newfield sees about $983,000 in savings. Franklin and Delsey Regional, as you would expect, are losing tuition revenues, and therefore they're going to see a tax increase in those two districts, which is mitigated by the reduction or loss of the Newfield students. So Newfield has about 20 to 25 students per grade level. So as I mentioned before, we try to maintain the class size in both directions. So when they come out of Franklin and Delsey, we adjust the teacher expense associated with those students down, and when they come into the new regional, Pittsgrove, Elmer, and Newfield, we adjust an increase in teachers and supplies and materials to reflect those new students coming in. That sometimes is not the case. And sometimes you can get an infusion of students into the district, and because of the grade configurations, you may be able to accept those students with your existing teaching staff, but do so with maybe a slight increase in class size. That's what I was saying before. That's going to be the new board's determination as to whether they take additional savings by bringing in the Newfield students without increasing teachers, or they decide to take some of those savings and invest it in additional services and programs, which may reduce the amount of savings they get. So that's going to be the new board's determination. So let's move to the next slide, which deals with the transition. So as was mentioned earlier in the education section, the students build a bond in their particular building and would transition out of that building into the new regional. Now, we've done many of these studies, and in some cases we recommend a longer phase out, a phase in period, because depending on how the buildings are configured, that may be more prudent to maintain those relationships. Because of the nature of the building configurations in Franklin and Delsey, we propose in the study a expedited phase out. And this is what the grade level phase out would look like. Because of the grade configurations in those schools, in year one, we would continue to send the Newfield students to their current send and receive relationship in grades 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, and 12. The grade levels that would start in the new regional would be pre-K and K, 3, 5, 7, and 9. Essentially, as the student would be going into a new school, instead of a new school in the current district, they would go into the new regional. And in year two, just 3 grade levels stay in the send and receive relationship. The balance goes into the new regional, and in year 3, there's only 1 remaining. The students that started in the 10th grade are now seniors. They would stay for the 3rd year, and then in year 4, it's fully phased out. That's the grade phase out. What's the transition for tax allocation and tax purposes? So as I mentioned before, the state allows an alternative mechanism for allocating the tax levy for the first 10 years. This proposal doesn't go a full 10 years. Essentially, what we are proposing here is that there's a 2-year transition, and during those first 2 years, there would be 100% enrollment would be the allocation mechanism that would be used. In year 3, it goes to the permanent allocation that we talked about earlier, 50% enrollment, 50% equalized valuation. In the first 2 years, Newfield, their tax levy would be frozen at what their pre-regional tax levy would be, or would have been. So meaning if in year 1 we are creating the regional, we would look back to the last year and see what Newfield's tax levy was, and that would be what they would contribute to the new regional. That essentially will allow additional tax revenue to be provided to the new regional so that they could deal with the costs of the remaining students in the send and receive, those tuition students. So you can see from this table, in year 1, Newfield's status quo and transitional tax levy are the same. And then in year 2, the transitional tax levy remains the same at $3.2 million. If you look above, in each year, all the communities see a tax levy reduction, even through the transition. Newfield, obviously in the first year, they're keeping the same amount from the prior year, so there's no increase or decrease. Given that there probably would be an increase, there's some tax savings in there by holding it the same, but it doesn't change in that first year. In the second year, as we have fewer students in the second year grade levels, then every community sees savings. And then the third year, when we go into the full phase-in of the permanent allocation, 50% enrollment, 50% equalized valuation, we see something more akin to what we were looking at in the earlier slide when we looked at what the 5-year average annual savings would be for each community. And we believe that this mechanism aligns with the new transitional allocation parameters that the legislation provides, and it also allows the communities to enter into the new regional in year one, and provides for additional funding to cover the tuition payments over the 3 years where there will still be students in the Franklin and Dulce regional school districts. The last thing I'll mention with regard to this is just to reiterate the indication of the tax levy. So there could be additional savings or less savings depending on what the new board decides. And that's going to be a decision that the new regional board will need to make. And just to sum up, this is a unique opportunity where every combination of equalized valuation and enrollment provides savings for all the communities. We've decided on a 50-50 split because we think that future-proofs the arrangement and the regional. We propose that there's the transition happening in year one, and that we have an allocation of a transitional allocation for 2 years that bridges the send receive tuition payments, and then revert to the permanent allocation in year 3. So that wraps my section up. I will turn it back over to
Thanks, Steve. So before we take some questions, I just want to go over the process a little in terms of where you are now and what might take place. So some of the things that we heard today, I want to just reiterate a few of them and maybe clarify a little bit. So when we talked about the educational analysis, you heard a phrase, there's no negative impact, right? And I'm sure that that's not what you're specifically looking for when you're looking to change the configuration of your school district, right? You're looking for positives. The reason why we use that phrase is that there's 2 things at play here. The first is creating a new regional school district. But the second, from Newfield's perspective, is that it must meet a certain standard in order to be permitted to terminate its current sending-receiving relationships with Franklin and Dulce. And in order to do that, the statute talks in the negative, that the commissioner must approve the request to terminate that send-receiving relationship, or relationships in this situation, unless there is going to be a substantial negative educational, financial, or racial impact. And so that's why you heard some of us use those phrases of a negative impact, that there are going to be a negative impact. And that's because that's the standard that we would have to show to the Commissioner of Education if Newfield were to seek to move from Franklin and Dulce into a new regional school district. At the end of the day, the study concluded that there are educational and financial benefits to this new relationship in terms of Newfield terminating its send-receive relationship with Dulce and Franklin and seeking to join a to-be-created new PK-12 regional school district with Elmer, Pittsgrove, and Newfield. Those benefits are laid out in the study in detail. We could be here all night if we went over all of them, so we just mentioned a few in terms of the highlights of it. The proposal, when Steve went over that one chart, the reason why we proposed a 2-year transition tax allocation method is because the process would look like this. Once the Commissioner of Education approves Newfield's ability to terminate its send-receive relationships, and then the public votes on creating a new regional school district. When those two things happen, at the date selected by the executive county superintendent, you would create a new regional school district. At that point in time, all of Newfield's students would become the new regional school district students. But some of them are still going to remain for several years based on that transitional phase out that Steve mentioned on the one side. Some of them would still be educated in Franklin and Delsey. And because of that, we wanted to make sure that there was a tax allocation method that reflected the fact that this new regional is now going to take on the costs of educating Newfield students, some of them someplace else. And so that is why you saw that specific chart, why there's a separate tax allocation method that we're proposing for those first 2 years. And then once those students are substantially transitioned into the new regional school district, at that point in time, the permanent tax allocation figure would kick in. Want to make it clear to you, this is a recommendation based on the financial analysis. It is 100% up to the governing bodies, one, if you move forward at all. But presuming you do want to move forward, that's a decision that your two boards of education would need to make together. So you would have to decide on whether that 50-50 allocation that we recommended is what you want to propose to the voters. So to the extent that anyone has a question about what the next steps might be, the next steps would be for your two boards to make a determination on if you want to present this issue to the voters in your communities. You would authorize the filing of a petition to the Commissioner of Education that would seek two things, the two things that I've just mentioned a few minutes ago. The termination of Newfield sending receiving relationships with Franklin and with Delsey, and the authorization from the Commissioner to put the question of forming a new regional school district before the voters in Pittsgrove, Elmer, and Newfield. That's the first step. The feasibility study and all of the documents that come with it would go to the Commissioner, and the Commissioner would make a determination. Franklin and Delsey would have the opportunity to oppose that petition, and if they do so, it would depend on there are two different paths that it could go, and we can discuss that in more detail at that point in time. But the first step would be that petition. At that point in time, once the petition is filed, the boards would also want to propose to the Commissioner what that tax allocation method would be. So you'd want to make that decision at some point in time early on in the process, so that you would be able to tell the Commissioner as well as the public when they vote on that question, what will the financial implications be of this new decision, this new regional district? What will it look like? How will the tax structure look like? How much money are we going to save and or spend? So with that, I will ask any board members who have any questions. We're happy to answer them for as long as you have questions.
Okay, I got a question for you.
Right.
When Elmer and Pittsgrove merged, there was the option of either regionalizing or consolidating. And I don't even remember the process now, it's been so long and there's so much to it. But we ended up consolidating, and we've had a wonderful relationship. But you're talking now about doing a regionalization. Is consolidation an option? And if not, why would that not be the case?
So technically speaking, consolidation would not be an option here, because Newfield is not currently in that sending receiving relationship with Pittsgrove and with Elmer. So at the time that Elmer and Pittsgrove consolidated, Elmer was a non-operating school district, which Newfield is, but Newfield is a non-operating school district someplace else. So because
Gotcha.
Elmer was a non-operating school district sending all of its students to Pittsgrove, there's a mechanism in the statute for that. Otherwise, for some odd reason, the state really did away with the consolidation mechanism in the Senate. I don't know if you were the commissioner at the time that that took place, but.
I'm old, but I'm not that old.
I don't know when it was done.
It was only 20, less than that,
Yeah.
consolidated districts in the state.
There are very few.
And that's why when the non-operating law came into effect, that led to your consolidation. They use that word consolidation because there's no longer a process allowing for the consolidation of school districts. The process available is a regionalization, which is the one being recommended here. But great question, by the way.
Really, the big difference, as you know, the consolidated district has open elections for all of the seats.
Yes.
Right, so at any given year, the Pittsgrove Board of Education can be made up of 9 members from Pittsgrove, 9 members from Elmer, or any combination depending on how the electorate vote in individuals. With a regional school district, you would be allocated specific seats. So in that respect, in the study, we provide, I believe our thought based on the census data would be that Elmer would have 1 seat on the board, Newfield would have 1 permanent seat on the board, and Pittsgrove would have the other 7 seats on the board based on the census data in terms of the population. So because of that, there would be that 1 dedicated seat. That seat, it goes on the ballot in Newfield and in Elmer, and only someone who resides in Newfield can run for and be elected into that Newfield seat, and likewise for Elmer. That's really the only, I don't know if you know of any other difference between the consolidated, you still have a tax allocation method, which you can select for a regional school district, but generally speaking, that's the distinction.
And the finance method, the way you did that, I like that a lot because, like, Elmer can be affected greatly by just a few numbers of students in or out. So the way you've done that, I think that's fantastic. The one thing Elmer didn't want to do is step on Pittsgrove's toes financially, because we kind of come into their school district and we don't want to be the one that, kind of takes the food off their plate. But, but as far as the dynamics of our board, it's worked fantastically. But Elmer and Pittsgrove we don't have a rift between us. It's not like it's Elmer versus Pittsgrove and vice versa. We have a harmonized school district and community. And, but of course, Newfield is farther away. I don't know, your board might feel completely different about it because if we were regionalized, you're going to absolutely have 1 person, but you'll only have 1 person. Danny and I are both on the board now, so of course I would step down and let Danny take the position because he obviously is the one that deserves a position here. But
well, Newfield finally just earned its first official seat on the Franklin Township Board, so you'll be happy to know you would have a permanent seat, K-12. Are there any other questions or comments? We're also not going anywhere, so if in the next couple of days or weeks you come up with any specific questions, you can always have Henry or Darren shoot them over to us, and we're happy to answer any of those questions. We're here for you throughout the process.
I would just like to add too that if anyone has any questions, we have set up comments at pittsgrove.net, and we'd be happy to field those questions in that area.
Perfect, and if you need any assistance from us, just let us know. We will help provide whatever information or data anyone asks for.
All those ask questions.
I'm not in charge of the meeting, I'm a guest, so.
So at this time, with the plan, this is a presentation for the Board of Education, and so the plan was to have that for the board to see, because the board, for the most part, hasn't seen the study till today. We didn't get the study till today, so that was the intent, to review it, and then I think the eventual goal is to post this on the website. We're gonna have an email for comment at pittsgrove.net and be able to address the questions that way with an FAQ and also respond to those questions.
So is there any other questions from the boards or administration? Well, thank you. It has been our pleasure to work with you on this very important project. We know how important it is to your communities. And so we're here for you if you have any additional questions or need any information. Thank you.
thank you, Carrie.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, if both boards decide to move forward, there obviously be more conversations, presentations to the public, and so on, if that was to happen. Correct.
Can I get a motion to recess?
Motion.
Second.
Motion and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So moved.